The ECPR Wildenmann Prize is a very important prize for ECPR, and it's awarded annually to a scholar before PhD within 5 years of receiving their PhD in recognition of an outstanding paper presented at the joint sessions of workshops. This can be a co-authored paper under certain circumstances or a single authored paper. The prize is named after Rudolf Wildenmann, a path-breaking German political scientist, who is regarded as one of the pioneers of empirical election research and a designer of the social science infrastructure in Germany and Europe. Wildenmann has been known to a broad public through his work on setting up the Mannheim research group elections at the University of Mannheim and his collaboration on the Politbarometer. The Wildenmann Prize is judged this year by a jury consisting of members of our executive committee and editors of our journals. The 2021 prize jury consists of Christian Herfer from the University of Vienna, Daniel Stockemer of the University of Ottawa, who is the editor of the European Political Science, and Alexander Segeberg, who is a professor at the Uppsala University and who is editor of Political Research Exchange, and of myself as a chair of this year's prize jury. This year's prize winner is Paul Meiners. Paul is a PhD candidate of the University of Münster for his paper, Information and Motivation: How do attitudes towards international organizations develop? A paper he presented at the ECPR joint sessions of workshops in May 2021. The jury has argued that our knowledge of international organizations has steadily progressed over the past years. Their role in global governance, their internal functioning, and their relationship with member states and civil society organizations has been studied by a growing community of scholars. However, our understanding of their relation to citizens or public opinion more generally has received slightly less attention. And it is here where the 2021 Wildenmann Prize winner, Paul Meiners, sheds new light. In his paper, Paul seeks to identify the factors that shape citizens' attitudes towards international organizations. He argues that while existing work focused on organizational and elite characteristics to explain these attitudes, social psychological variables linked to the capability of citizens to evaluate international organizations' legitimacy are more significant elements to explain these attitudes. His paper develops an experimental research design, drawing on psychological work on heuristics, through which he aims to systematically compare the effects of various variables identified in the literature on international organizations on citizens' attitudes towards them. Using a sample of the German population, Paul shows that the effortful reflexive reasoning indeed determines citizens' attitudes more than partisanship understood as heuristic shortcuts. The jury was impressed by the methodological risk-taking present in this paper, as well as the systematic caveats that feature in the paper when presenting the results. Methodologically, Paul employs cutting-edge experimental techniques to test his expectation based on a pre-registered factual survey experiment using a large sample of the German population. He finds that citizens respond to information about the authority of international organizations even in the presence of strong party cues. These effects are amplified when respondents are motivated to engage in reflective reasoning. It is this synthetic design, rigorous and novel theorizing, and cutting-edge methodological design that convinced the jury members that the paper would make an excellent contribution to the literature on the relationship between public opinion and international organizations.
My name is Tobias Lenz, and I'm Professor of International Relations at Leuphana University Lüneburg in Germany. Together with my colleague Sarah von Billerbeck from the University of Reading, I conducted the workshop at last year's joint sessions, at which Paul Meiners presented his award-winning paper. And I want to tell you a little bit about the background of the workshop itself, as well as the reasons for why we found Paul's paper to be worthy of being nominated for the award. The workshop that Sarah and I conducted was entitled "The Legitimation of International Organizations in Disruptive Times." And we sought to examine how international organizations respond to the increasing contestation and critique that surrounds many of their activities in today's multipolar and increasingly heterogeneous and diverse world. Sarah and I have both been working on international organizations and questions of legitimacy for a number of years. In fact, Sarah has published prominently on how states in the United Nations legitimize international peacekeeping activities. That was her specific research focus. And I myself have set up a research group at the German Institute of Global and Area Studies, which studies the various ways, discursive, institutional, and behavioral, in which regional organizations seek to legitimize their authority. And so Sarah and I joined forces to explore exciting research that's being done in this field today, and with a focus especially on younger scholars who often bring the most kind of innovative and creative ideas to new research fields. So last May, we met virtually for 3 days to discuss 15 papers. It was a pity, of course, that we could not meet in person. But we had an extremely intense and I think inspiring discussion. The participants shared a keen interest in the empirical study of IO legitimacy. We shared a common vocabulary, which is not self-evident often. And participants were willing to deeply engage with each other's work. So for me, the workshop really confirmed once again why this is ECPR's flagship format, if I may say. Interestingly, Paul was the last person to present his paper at the workshop after he'd been discussing other papers and engaging with other papers for 2.5 days. But his paper stuck out, and I'm going to say a few words now about why we think that it did so. As Sabine has already said, Paul's paper conducts a survey experiment to analyze the factors that shape citizens' attitudes towards international organizations. Now, this is a very relevant and important strand of research because international organizations have gained significantly in authority over the past 3 decades or so. And today they touch upon the lives of citizens within their member states, increasingly so. The EU with its common market and common currency is a kind of a very prominent and outstanding example, but other IOs do so as well. Just think of peace enforcement or peacekeeping missions that the United Nations and others conduct. And so this effect of IOs on people's lives means that regular citizens are increasingly becoming a relevant audience in IO's attempt to convince them of their right to rule, of their legitimacy. So in other words, IOs cannot ignore what citizens think about them. And I think this is why it's important to understand the factors that shape citizens' beliefs. And this is what Paul's paper does with a specific focus on Germany. Sarah and I believe that the paper made kind of 3 important contributions, which is why we nominated the paper for the prize. Firstly, it has a novel analytical focus. So much of the literature focuses on specific characteristics of international organizations themselves or the cues that political elites send, while Paul's paper shifts towards the citizens themselves and the process by which they process information. The second reason is that he engages in novel and creative theorizing to understand this information process by citizens. So he draws on psychological work on heuristics, which was pioneered by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, to theorize this process. And his main hypothesis is a conditional one. So he hypothesizes that established factors are conditioned by the ability of citizens to think effortfully about international organization legitimacy. So what is neat about this, we thought, is that it synthesizes existing literature in interesting ways and doesn't kind of discard it or dispose with it, but says all of this is important, but it's conditioned by the way in which citizens themselves engage with that information and these characteristics. And then thirdly, as Sabine already mentioned too, the paper uses a cutting edge and uniquely suited, we think, experimental design to test this main hypothesis. It's a factorial survey experiment that uses a large sample of the German population, and this was done in kind of established ways by pre-registering it. And the neat thing about these factorial survey experiments is that they allow him to compare the effect sizes of the various potential determinants that existing work has identified while testing for his own hypothesis defect. And so the main finding that emerges from the paper is that citizens matter to the way in which they think about international organization. It's not just the information that they receive, as it were, but how they process that information. So even in the presence of strong party cues, this information processing is a relevant, important determinant of citizens' belief. So the combination of these three things, a new analytical focus, creative theorizing, and a rigorous methodological design, makes this an outstanding paper. And Sarah and I believe that it is highly deserving of the Rudolf Wildenmann Prize 2021. So congratulations for this great achievement.
So my name is Paul Meiners. I'm a research associate at the Institute of Political Science, working with Professor Bernd Schlippack at the University of Münster. And here I'm also a graduate student at the Graduate School of Politics since 2018. And I'm really honored to receive the Rudolf Wildenmann Prize for this paper. And I would like to thank the members of the jury and also, of course, the organizers of the workshop for this opportunity. So in many ways, I think this motivates me to continue writing in the direction of the paper and to go on with the work in this direction. And the idea for the paper, interestingly enough, was first really born during the discussions during the joint sessions of workshops of 2019, where I first presented an overview of my dissertation. And I think without this first influence of the joint sessions, my research would have gone in a completely different direction. And in my opinion, the last joint sessions had a comparable impact on my work. So in my study, from my point of view, I start from the argument that an increase in authority of an international organization can have some potential negative effects on public opinion. Yet the precise mechanism here is not clear at all, I think. While some think that the population might be directly against an increase in authority at the national level, others have strong doubts about this possibility, citing other sources of opinions as more plausible. And it's likely that heuristic shortcuts play an important role here. And to solve this puzzle, I use approaches from public opinion research and cognitive psychology, mostly, and I test the different explanations in a factorial experiment. I find that information about the authority of international organizations does matter, even when other influences on opinions are present as well. And in general, we can see that communicating an increase of authority of an international organization might be really necessary. And when it comes to my other work, most recently research together with Ben Schlippach and Osman Kiratli on the effects of COVID-19 on support for the WHO has been accepted for publication in the Review of International Organizations. But in general, I'm working on finishing my PhD first and foremost. And here I look at other aspects related to the messaging of international authority to the general population, also using experimental methods, but also working with surveys. For example, I look at the complexity of messaging of EU infringement procedures, and I look at detailed processing of information on topics related to international authority.
The ECPR Wildenmann Prize contributes to one of the ECPR core values, that is allowing young scholars to integrate a larger scholarly community that will be their future home. And Paul just has underlined the way he has worked on this particular paper and on his PhD, which shows to what extent his link with ECPR is already and has been strong in the past. In the name of the Rudolf Wildenmann Prize jury, I would like to congratulate Paul once again for his outstanding paper on information and motivation. How do attitudes towards international organizations develop? His paper really reaches beyond IR studies and allows us to ask, what will determine the coherence of a political system in the future? One of the central questions for political scientists in general. Congratulations, Paul.